You check your phone. A blue dot blinks on a map, a route already drawn, a calm voice ready to tell you exactly when to turn. 19 minutes to your destination. No guessing. No argument with whoever is in the passenger seat about whether you missed the exit 3 miles back. The app already knows, and it already won that argument before it started. You barely even look up. You just go. Now take all of that away. Every satellite, every road sign, every GPS. Delete the maps entirely, because for almost the entire span of human history, there weren't any. No paper either. No names for most of the places you'd be walking toward, because nobody who came before you had ever been there to name them. And yet your ancestors walked out of Africa and never really stopped. No wheels, no horses, no compass, no sextant, no written word to pass a route down to the next generation. Within a few 100,000 years, on foot and by raft, human beings had reached nearly every corner of the planet. Deserts, ice fields, mountain passes, islands so remote that the nearest land wasn't even visible from the shore. So how did people with nothing but their legs, their memory, and a guess manage to cross oceans they couldn't see the other side of? Here's the part that should stop you. Some of the hardest crossings in this story were not accidents. They were repeated deliberately by people who had never laid eyes on the destination and who somehow trusted it was there anyway. Which raises a stranger question. If your ancestors could do that with nothing, why does your own body still ache to get up and move the second it sits still too long? Start with the walking, because the walking alone shouldn't have been possible. Zoom out far enough, and the spread out of Africa barely looks like a migration at all. Some estimates put the pace at only 1 kilometer or 2 of new ground a year, generation folding into generation, nobody alive ever seeing more than a sliver of the actual journey. Nobody decided to cross a continent. They just kept following the next ridge, the next river, the next place that looked like it might hold food, and a few 100,000 years later, without a single person intending it, the species had rewritten its own map. Harvard biologist Daniel Lieberman and his colleague Dennis Bramble spent years studying something strange about the human body. It isn't built like a sprinter's. It's built like a machine for covering absurd distances on foot for hours in heat. Long legs relative to body size. Springy tendons in the arch of the foot that store and release energy like a coiled spring. A ligament running down the back of the neck that barely exists in other primates, whose only real function is to keep your head stable while the rest of you is bouncing along at a run. Their research, published in the journal Nature, argued that the genus Homo evolved specifically for endurance. For a hunting method where you don't outrun the animal, you simply outlast it, tracking it for hours under open sun until it collapses from heat before you do. Researcher Louis Liebenberg spent decades documenting a living version of exactly this, following trackers in the Kalahari who still run down antelope the same way, not with speed, but with patience the animal doesn't have. Your fitness tracker buzzes with quiet pride over 6,000 steps. Your ancestors were doing that before lunch, then hunting for the rest of the afternoon, then walking home. That explains the body. It does not explain the oceans. Long before Homo sapiens existed at all, something else may have already solved a piece of this puzzle. On the Indonesian island of Flores, paleoanthropologist Mike Morwood and his team uncovered stone tools tied to an early human relative on an island separated from the mainland by a channel of open water even at the lowest sea levels of the Ice Age. However it happened, some hominin crossed water it could not see across over 1 million years before anyone who looked like you existed. Here's the question that should be sitting in the back of your mind right now. If walking out of Africa took generation after generation, Why didn't people just keep walking in every direction the moment a path opened up? For thousands of years, a lot of them didn't. Ancient DNA points to something researchers now call the Beringian standstill, evidence that a population moving toward the Americas didn't simply stroll across the land bridge and keep walking east. They stopped. Archaeologist John Hoffaker and biological anthropologist Dennis O'Rourke helped build the case, using genetics and paleoecology together, that a group of people lived on that exposed stretch of land between Siberia and Alaska for several thousand years, cut off, waiting, while a wall of glacial ice blocked the route south like a locked door with no key. Picture that door for a second. Not a wall you climb over in an afternoon. A barrier of ice thick enough and wide enough to make an entire population simply stop and build a life where they stood. Hunting the same herds, telling the same stories, raising children who would never see the land their own children eventually would, for longer than most civilizations have existed. Then, slowly, the ice loosened its grip. A corridor opened, and the walking started again as if it had never stopped. Not a shortcut, a holding pattern longer than recorded history. Here's where it gets stranger though, because a land bridge is one thing. What happened in Australia doesn't have that excuse. For decades, the assumption was almost lazy. Someone got swept out to sea, maybe clinging to a fallen tree during a storm, and washed up on a continent nobody was aiming for. A lucky accident that happened to work out. Then archaeologist Chris Clarkson and a team from the University of Queensland re-excavated a rock shelter called Majedba Bay in northern Australia, and the accident story stopped holding up. They found ground ochre used for symbolic decoration. Sophisticated stone tool technology, carefully made, not the kind of thing a stranded castaway improvises on an unfamiliar shore. Clear evidence of a population established at least 65,000 years ago, which rules out a single lucky raft. Even at the lowest sea levels of the last ice age, when the islands strung between mainland Southeast Asia and Sahul sat closer together than they do now, the final stretch still meant open water with no land in sight from either side. Researchers modeling ocean currents, combined with the number of people required to found a population that actually survives long-term, argue it would have taken repeated crossings, spread across generations, not a single desperate voyage. Not once. Repeatedly. On purpose. By people who had never seen where they were headed and somehow kept going back for more of their own community. Which is a lot of advanced planning for a species that, today, still forgets to bring a jacket. That isn't luck. That's navigation. Which brings up a piece of this story most people have never heard. How exactly do you cross open ocean with zero instruments and still find your way home? Thousands of years later, and thousands of miles away, Pacific Islander navigators were doing exactly that, at a scale that still humbles sailors with satellites strapped to their wrists. No compass. No charts. Just the angle of starlight at the horizon, tracked star by star as each one rose and set in the same place every night. The direction and rhythm of ocean swells, felt through the hull of a canoe, distinct enough to be read like a signature. The flight paths of birds that only nest on land followed home at dusk. Anthropologist Ben Finney spent years studying this system, then testing it, eventually helping build a traditional voyaging canoe and sailing it more than 2,000 miles from Hawaii to Tahiti using nothing but this inherited, memorized method. Modern satellite tracking, run alongside the voyage as a check, confirmed the canoe held its course. Landfall on a speck of island in an empty ocean, with no instrument more advanced than a trained eye and a lifetime of memorized patterns passed down by navigators who had done this before. Your ancestors were carrying an entire navigation system. It just wasn't built from satellites. It was built from stars, waves, and memory. And it was accurate enough that people staked their lives on it over and over for generations. Here's where all of this starts pointing somewhere personal. Geneticist Svante Pääbo at the Max Planck Institute for Evolutionary Anthropology helped sequence the genome of an entirely different kind of human, the Denisovans, known mostly from a handful of bone fragments found in a single Siberian cave. And yet traces of Denisovan DNA now turn up at meaningful levels in populations in Papua New Guinea, across island Southeast Asia, and elsewhere in the Pacific, thousands of miles from that cave, separated by open ocean and mountain ranges. Neither group had any obvious reason to cross. The only way that DNA travels that far is if people carried it themselves, walking, rafting, sailing, generation after generation, until a lineage that started in one cold cave ended up woven into the ancestry of people scattered across half the planet. Walk it forward, and the pattern repeats everywhere you look. A land bridge crossed on foot, an ocean crossed by boat, a strait crossed on a raft. Nobody wrote down the design for. Different routes, different centuries, different tools, and the same underlying decision made again and again by people who had every reason to stay where the food and the fire already were. We didn't just survive by staying put and slowly adapting to wherever we happened to be. We survived by moving relentlessly into places that offered no guarantee anyone would make it, and somehow, enough of us did, every single time, to keep the whole species going. That restlessness didn't switch off. It's still sitting in your legs right now. The urge to pace when you're anxious. The itch to get up and walk when you're stuck on a problem you can't solve, sitting still. The specific, almost physical relief of a long walk with nowhere urgent to be. None of that is a personality quirk. It's leftover hardware. A nervous system shaped by a few 100,000 years of ancestors who solved their biggest problems by moving through the world, not by sitting still in front of one. They didn't have the option of staying put and hoping the problem resolved itself. Moving was the solution, over and over, for so long that it became wired in not as a choice you make, but as a pull you feel, whether or not you ever act on it. You don't need any of it to survive anymore. The blue dot does the deciding now. Turn left in 200 feet. But the body following those directions is the same body that once stood on a beach it had never seen before, looking at open water with no visible end, and decided to get in the boat anyway.